Ja bih samo na kratko da podsjetim, 2003. godine, dakle ova priča traje skoro 10 godina.
Briefly, just to remind, in 2003, this story has been lasting for almost 10 years by the Thessalonica Agenda for the Western Balkans, which defines the criteria and the rules of game for the pre-accession countries. Then they were considering the countries of the region which are covered right now by the decade of Roma. 2003, in the Copenhagen, in addition to the European criteria, there were also political preconditions. Also, the political preconditions are the topic that we can seriously discuss. How thus the membership of the EU requires human rights, rule of law, respect of minorities, and then that was nothing new, and to the current countries when they enter the final phase of joining EU. The EU criteria and the EU framework are almost identical with the priorities of the decade of Roma, and to a great extent prove the thesis that the decade has been successful, and the goals of the decade has transferred their focus on a center of power, which is the EU, which has the power to impose the political conditions. And to be clear, the governments of the countries are the main responsible bodies of all those activities. That is, the governments of the states. As the colleague from Bulgaria, Sally, said, what is the job of the NGOs? We should not mix the heads, the responsibilities. We should know our responsibilities. Everything starts with the system of responsibilities. The governments are responsible for creating policies and implementing the policies in regard to the Roma. The EU candidate countries should set goals, allocate appropriate financial resources. They should not, at the beginning of the implementation of the strategy, should look for international foundations, because Roma are their citizens and they have to allocate financial resources within their budgets to define specific action plans and to develop a monitoring system to measure the progress. And as you can see today, this is the 22nd International Steering Committee of the decade. In the previous session, we had reports on relative categories. We haven't succeeded, even though we have people from UNDP, to impose a system of measurement. If you cannot measure something, and everything that you cannot quantify, it means it does not exist, basically, if you cannot measure it or quantify it. And this topic of measurement within the decade of Roma has been present on the agenda for several years, and I don't know why we haven't done it so far. I would like for the Croatia, in addition to the agenda that you proposed, to try to impose some mandate of this kind of topic. It will help us in the final phase of EU before pre-accession to EU. The NGOs methods to policy influencing. Many countries express or share their results, but the assessment of the impact is something that, for those absolute results and figures put into a context, you can have as some, let's say, absurd, to have 1,000 students. But semi-literate 1,000 students in the first year, this assessment of the impact, especially the category, how many of these, to what extent these students contribute to the emancipation of the Roma and the situation of the Roma. Have you paid the education of someone's child and who is assimilated afterwards, and you lose it? But we want highly educated people who will come back to the community and make the changes. We do not highly educated Roma so they can get married well. We educate people to make changes, And within this context, there is a need to kind of sharpen the criteria in order to have the impact of the assessment of the whole overall context. And there is one more thing: the administrative elites in the countries, almost in all countries, have become an elite and just take the right to write the projects, design the strategies without the consultative process. Thus, the Roma organizations are not aware of the IPA projects. Why is it like this? This is some kind of way of behavior. In addition to the League of the Decade, we will not allow this anymore. We have even less reports from those IPA projects. This is serious money, serious activities, political responsibility. If you write the project for the minority that you do not belong to, you haven't consulted anybody. This is a typical manipulation. Those financial reports of the implemented IPA projects can become a topic of the Roma NGOs. We have IPA projects, we have been implemented. You have to read the reports just for the sake of reading and for the science. The decade is truly an historic process for the Roma people, and I say small step for the humanity, but a great step ahead for the millions of Roma. And this is a great cultural, political, economic, educational movement which has given great results, and this is the most prosperous period in the history of Roma. We are rich in the suffering of Roma people, but this is something that is a dream of many of the new generations, of many generations before us. What does the EU do for many years? For the pre-accession process, the exclusion of the Roma is not compatible with our social values and our economic model. The governments, regardless of the number of changes of governments, they should always know, and I think that the governments of the countries have a special view or opinion, which can be considered from different aspects, critical, so for sure. In this process, pre-accession process, we have a feature of like 3.8 million of Roma interested in this process. And how is it? I want to know how it's going to finish, what will be the consequences, the speed, effectiveness, and what will we give to the Roma people, to the state administration, and so on. What we have as a kind of development, as appearance, and in the previous session we talked about it, something as like an evergreen topic, discrimination. I have the title of economic egoism, reactive nationalism, latent racism, and what we are talking about in essence. I just want to say that after 7 years of the decade, we have reactive nationalism in regard to the Roma. The number of attacks to Roma has grown. The League for Decade of the Roma Decade keeps record of all the incidents that we find on internet. This is a growth of the number of attacks, conflicts, murders, speech of hatred, and so on. We haven't hoped for this. And our supposition is that this reactive nationalism is latent racism, which is even in Europe and the European Union is being tolerated. I can simply not accept the fact that if we have adopted the political criteria, economic criteria, moral and so on, to tolerate torturing by the fascists towards the Roma people in certain countries. This leads greatly, put into a problem all this story. the question given to the European intellectuals and European elite that are supposed to support this process. Will Europe by 2012 win over the ethnocentrism, xenophobia, racism, or the clear common sense will win over? Or multiculturalism, even though some say that multiculturalism is dead, but I think it's not. And great number of citizens of Europe think multiculturalism is not dead. You cannot forgive success. We have this impatience towards Roma people, and it's a direct ratio. Are the racists more powerful and sound? And the national strategies are as such, they're only documents, but even in the documents of a European Commission and European Union, without actions, determined actions, you cannot talk about strategies. We have the title Clear Conditions and not unclear local policies. The European Commission will talk about the policies in regard to the Roma. The policies are not clear. The protection of the citizens from the discrimination from areas of like promotion of social dialogue among Roma and between Roma and non-Roma in the fight against racism and xenophobia. You can see in some countries that there is some kind of social dialogue which will cover both the economic issues, the political issues, and the issues of political discrimination and security. We are not talking about just discriminations, but also there is a discrimination when our security is endangered, and this is a new term that we are going to use in the upcoming period. Overall implementation of relevant laws against racially motivated incidents. Is there anti-discriminatory policy in certain countries? You can measure it only by proving the number of processes or cases and how they've been solved. And you cannot find this information in our committees, and we will insist on it. But I must share with you from the point of view of NGOs, and we have been partially conformist in the intention in order not to spoil the good political will of our state administrations. We must clearly distinguish the non-government, the civil society sector and government activities. NGOs cannot substitute the state, and this is certainly present. What are we preparing? I hope that the Secretariat will support it, and we have to do something in regard to the monitoring of those strategies and all possible plans regarding the decade and pre-accession process. These reports must be controlled by the NGOs and in direct way, especially with direct participation in the writing of those acts, which mean beginning of the practical policies in regard to the Roma people. We had this decade watch, and I don't know, we haven't continued with it. The example of Serbia, I don't want to criticize the other countries. Serbia received financial assistance from 2001 to 2011, 2 billion euro and 5.8 first as donations and 5.8 billion euro as loans for inclusion. But you have different types of inclusion. But I'm not saying social inclusion on purpose. This money has reached the Roma people in a minimum percentage. Luckily, we have stabilized the system, and we have some kind of a system which is possible to be monitored. I will not talk about the results, what we have done, what can be an obstacle in the EU membership. For Serbia, we haven't adopted the action plan for 2012-2004 due to the elections, due to some political willingness in the given ministry. What is good in Serbia is that you can see the Serbian weddings where they sing Roma songs, and this is a measure of tolerance. This is a measure of multiculturalism and interculturalism. Very subtle measure, and I have a sufficient number of mixed, maybe not sufficient, but there is a certain number of mixed marriages. And I want to say we cannot join EU without Roma, and we'll insist on it. And at the end, one philosophical question: do the governments have problems with the Roma, or the Roma have problems with their governments? Thank you for your attention.
Jedno filozofsko pitanje. Da li vlade imaju problem sa Romima ili Romi imaju problem sa svojim vladama? I hvala vam na pažnji.